Hello, everybody. Welcome to this, which is the final chapter in Book 1 of Past and Present. I thought, end of the week. It's been a tough week, lots of different things going on, lots of tough news, but also just work in general. And this coincided with the end of the book, so I thought, why not have a nice chilled out stream, reading a bit of Thomas Carlyle, and then having a bit of a discussion afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to read through the final chapter. If you haven't heard the others or read the others yet, I'd encourage you after the stream to go and look at the playlist that I've created of the first book of Past and Present. And then following that, I'm going to give a bit of discussion to the themes and key ideas in Book 1 of Past and Present, and also try to relate them to Carlyle's Calvinist background. Because I think, and this is something that's often not fully investigated by people looking at Carlyle, that there's a lot of similarities between Calvinist theology, especially as it was practiced in Scotland, and Carlyle's own ideas. So we'll look at those after after I've read the chapter. So without further ado, I'm going to kick off with Chapter 6, Hero Worship. To the present editor, not less than to Bobus, a government of the wisest, what Bobus calls an aristocracy of talent, seems the one healing remedy. But he is not so sanguine as Bobus with respect to the means of realizing it. He thinks that we have at once missed realizing it, and come to need it so pressingly, by departing far from the inner eternal laws and taking up with temporary outer semblances of laws. He thinks that enlightened egoism, never so luminous, is not the rule by which man's life can be led. That laissez-faire, supply and demand, cash payment for the soul nexus, and so forth, were not, are not, and will never be a practicable law of union for a society of men. That poor and rich, that governed and governing, cannot long live together on any such law of union. Alas, he thinks that man has a soul in him, different from the stomach in any sense of this word, that if said soul be asphyxiated and lie quietly forgotten, the man and his affairs are in a bad way. He thinks that the said soul will have to be resuscitated from its asphyxia, that if it is to prove irresuscitable, the man is not long for this world. In brief, the Midas-eared mammonism, double-barreled dilettantism, and their 1,000 adjuncts and corollaries are not the law by which God Almighty has appointed this universe to go. That, once for all, these are not the law, and then farther that we shall have to return to what is the law, not by smooth flowery paths, it is like, and with tremendous cheers in our throat, but over steep untrodden places, through storm-clad chasms, waste oceans, and the bosom of tornadoes. Thank heaven, if not through very chaos and the abyss. The resuscitating of a soul that has gone to asphyxia is no momentary or pleasant process, but a long and terrible one. To the present editor, hero worship, as he has elsewhere named it, means much more than an elected parliament or stated aristocracy of the wisest. For, in his dialect, it is the summary, ultimate essence, and supreme practical perfection of all manner of worship, and true worships and noblenesses whatsoever. Such blessed parliament, and, were it once in perfection, blessed aristocracy of the wisest, God-honoured and man-honoured, he does look for, more and more perfected. as the topmost blessed practical apex of a whole world reformed from sham worship, informed anew with worship, with truth and blessedness. He thinks that hero worship, done differently in every different epoch of the world, is the soul of all social business among men. That the doing of it well, or the doing of it ill, measures accurately what degree of well-being or of ill-being there is in the world's affairs. He thinks that we, on the whole, do our hero worship worse than any nation in this world ever did it before. That the Burns an exciseman, the Byron a literary lion, are intrinsically, all things considered, a baser and falser phenomenon than the Odin a god, the Muhammad a prophet of God. It is this editor's clear opinion, accordingly, that we must learn to do our hero worship better, that to do it better and better means the awakening of the nation's soul from asphyxia, and the return of blessed life to us. Heaven's blessed life, not Mammon's galvanic accursed one. To resuscitate the asphyxiated, apparently now moribund, and in the last agony if not resuscitated, such and no other seems the consummation. Hero worship, if you will, yes, friends, but, first of all, by being ourselves of heroic mind, a whole world of heroes, a world not of flunkies, where no hero king can reign. That is what we aim at. We, for our share, will put away all flunkyism, baseness, unveracity from us. We shall then hope to have our noblenesses and veracities set over us. Never till then. Let Bobus and company sneer. That is your reform? Yes, Bobus, that is our reform. And except in that, and what will follow out of that, we have no hope at all. Reform, like charity, O Bobus, must begin at home. Once well at home, now will it radiate outwards, irrepressible, into all that we touch and handle, speak and work, kindling ever new light by incalculable contagion, spreading in geometric ratio far and wide, doing good only, wheresoever it spreads, and not evil. By reform bills, anti-corn law bills, and thousand other bills and methods, we will demand of our governors, with emphasis, and for the first time not without effect, that they cease to be quacks or else depart, that they set no quackeries and blockheadisms anywhere to rule over us, that they utter or act no cant to us, that it will be better if they do not. For we shall now know quacks when we see them, cant when we hear it, shall be horrible to us. We will say, with the poor Frenchman at the bar of convention, though in wiser style than he, and for the space not of an hour but of a lifetime, arrestment of the knaves and dastards. Ah, we know what a work that is, how long it will be before they are all or mostly got arrested. But here is one. Arrest him in God's name. It is one fewer. We will, in all practicable ways, by word and silence, by act and refusal to act, energetically demand arrestment, and by degrees infallibly attain spreads, till all is luminous, till the cry, arrest your knaves and dastards, rises imperative from millions of hands. Even now, we do not countenance them, thou there. Turn away from their lacquered sumptuosities, their belauded sophistries, their serpent graciosities, their spoken and acted cant, with a sacred horror, with an apage Satanus, Bobus and company, and all men will gradually join us. We demand arrestment of the knaves and dastards, and begin by arresting our own poor selves out of that fraternity. There is no other reform conceivable. Thou and I, my friend, can, in the most flunky world, make each one of us one non-flunky, one hero, if we like. That will be two heroes to begin with. Courage! Even that is a whole world of heroes to end with, or what we poor two can do in the furtherance thereof. Yes, friends, hero kings and a whole world not unheroic, there lies the port and happy haven, towards which, through all the storm-tossed seas, French revolutions, Chartisms, Manchester insurrections, that make the heart sick in these bad days, the supreme powers are driving us. On the whole, blessed be the supreme powers, stern as they are. Towards that haven will we, O friends, let all true men, with what of faculty is in them, bend valiantly, incessantly, with thousandfold endeavour, thither, thither, there or else, in the ocean abysses, it is very clear to me, we shall arrive. Well, here truly is no answer to the Sphinx question. Not the answer of a disconsolate public, inquiring at the College of Health what was in hopes of a total change of regimen, change of constitution and existence from the very centre of it, a new body to be got, with resuscitated soul, not without convulsive travail throes, as all birth and new birth presupposes travail. This is sad news to a disconsolate discerning public, hoping to have got off by some Morrison's pill, some St. John's corrosive mixtures, and perhaps a little blistery friction on the back. We were prepared to part with our corn law, with various laws and unlaws. But this? What is this? Nor has the editor forgotten how it fares with your ill-boding Cassandras and sieges of Troy. Imminent perdition is not usually driven away by words of warning. Didactic destiny has other methods in store, or these would fail always. Such words should, nevertheless, be uttered when they dwell truly in the soul of any man. Words are hard, are importunate, but how much harder the importunate events they foreshadow. Here and there a human soul may listen to words, who knows how many souls, whereby the importunate events, if not diverted and prevented, will be rendered less hard. The present editor's purpose is to himself full of hope. For though fierce travails, though wide seas and roaring gulfs lie before us, is it not something if a lodestar, in the eternal sky, do once more disclose itself, an everlasting light, shining through all cloud tempests and roaring billows, ever as we emerge from the trough of the sea, the blessed beacon, far off on the edge of far horizons, towards which we are to steer incessantly for life? Is it not something? O heavens, is it not all? There lies the heroic promised land, under the heaven's light, my brethren bloom, the happy isles. There, oh there, thither will we, there dwells the great Achilles, whom we knew. There dwell all heroes, and will dwell. Thither, all ye heroic-minded. The heaven's lodestar once clearly in our eye, how will each true man stand truly to his work in the ship? How, with undying hope, will all things be fronted, all be conquered? Nay, with the ship's prow once turned in that direction, is not all, as it were, already well? Sick wasting misery has become noble manful effort with a goal in our eye. The choking nightmare chokes us no longer, for we stir under it. The nightmare has already fled. Certainly, could the present editor instruct men how to know wisdom, heroism, when they see it, that they might do reverence to it only, and loyally make it ruler over them? Yes, he were the living epitome of all editors, teachers, prophets that now teach and prophesy. He were an Apollo Morrison, a Trismegistus, an effective Cassandra. Let no able editor hope such things. It is to be expected the present laws of copyright, rate of reward per sheet, and other considerations will save him from that peril. Let no editor hope such things. No. And yet, let all editors aim towards such things, and even towards such alone. One knows not what the meaning of editing and writing is, if even this be not it. Enough, to the present editor, it has seemed possible some glimmering of light, for here and there a human soul might lie in these confused paper masses now entrusted to him. Wherefore he determines to edit the same. Out of old books, new writings, and much meditation not of yesterday, he will endeavour to select a thing or two, and from the past, in a circuitous way, illustrate the present and the future. The past is a dim, indubitable fact. The future, too, is one, only dimmer. Nay, properly, it is the same fact in new dress and development. For the present holds in it both the whole past and the whole future. As the life tree Yggdrasil, wide-waving, many-toned, has its roots down deep in the death kingdoms, among the oldest dead dust of men, and with its boughs reaches always beyond the stars, and in all times and places is the one and the same life tree. So that's the end of Past and Present, Book 1, Chapter 6 there. There's 6 chapters. The rest of the book is broken up into a further four books. The second one, which hopefully in the future we'll be able to do some readings from, is a historical study. It essentially follows an ancient monk and a heroic way of life that this medieval monk had. Following on from there, Carlyle in Book 3 brings the insights from the past that he's just alluded to into the modern times, essentially examining the modern worker and his values and what shapes his life. And finally, in Book 4, we have horoscope, so the future, where can this be going? But for the moment, I just want to give a brief discussion to Book 1 and a summary of the chapters that we've looked at over the last few months and done readings of. What are some of the key themes here? And how do they tie up with the chapter that we've just read? I think that's important because the language Carlyle uses can often be misleading or quite difficult to interpret. And he uses multiple voices. He takes on the voice of Bobus at one point, the editor. There's various others too. So just giving a wee treatment of the key arguments here might help to elucidate what's been read before. So I think the first place to begin, there's so many that could be engaged with, is Carlyle believes that there is a deep problem with England during this period. It's not just something that can be solved with a political solution. It's no good bringing forward a policy or suggesting that we need a new economic approach or even having a new government in power. These are not solutions to the problem with England. which is evidenced, in his view, by the conditions of the working man. For the working person, despite this culture of laissez-faire, the classical liberal economic system, which seems to be booming in Victorian England with the Industrial Revolution, many people are starving. They're poor. They're living in poverty. In the first and second chapters, he particularly addresses this, that there was a case in the newspaper of somebody dying. There was another from starvation, but even worse, in the newspaper, there was a case of a mother and father killing one of their children so that they could get the insurance money for it, that they could survive, essentially. And Carlyle is saying, this is evidence that there's something wrong with this country, deeply wrong. And if we continue down this track, it's going to be lost forever. There needs to be change as a result. And this is seen, in his view, in the Manchester insurrection, which is the topic of chapter 3. Manchester insurrection was essentially thousands of working people protesting in the street non-violently. And this was criticized at the time for not being a violent revolution like in France, that it didn't go far enough in that regard. But Carlyle's argument is essentially that these people know something's wrong. The working man knows something's wrong, and that's the barometer of a nation's health in many ways. But who are they going to fight? The problem isn't just one person here. It's the whole system. It's all the values that underpin England during this period. Who can you go and overthrow? Just replacing the current government isn't going to solve the problem, because we're led by the wrong people already, and the values that they go by, the whole ruling class, is the problem. And it's also the problem of the society at large. So it's no good saying, have a violent revolution. But the insurrection, the protest, the silent standing, acknowledging there's a problem, is itself indicative of what's wrong in England. And this connects nicely with his Calvinist upbringing in part here, because in Calvinist theology, there's the idea of the sensus divinitatis. This is the idea that, and it's from the book of Romans that Calvin gets this idea, that there is an awareness that all human beings have of the presence of God and of the existence of God in the world, that we intuitively have a knowledge of God's glory and majesty through the beauty of creation, its order, its design, in our conscience with the moral order, that when we do something bad, we feel that we've done something wrong. This is a sense of the divinitatis. And I think Carlyle's tapping into this when he's saying the working person knows that actually there's something wrong with this country, can't articulate what's wrong with it, doesn't know how to solve it, but the fact that thousands are protesting in the street because they're dying and they're too poor to live, that's the sense divinitatis. They know what's natural. And that, I think, leads us nicely into why it's wrong. It's against nature. Carlyle has a very strong natural law theory, as it were. He'll often talk about justice, the true, the beautiful, using capital letters for these words, and that they are eternal laws which guide the universe. He'll sometimes talk about it being the will of God, but he's not necessarily tying himself to theism, strictly speaking. He's more trying to articulate the sense that there's a transcendent moral and teleological order to things that governs all things. That is how the world ought to be. And that England during this period has clearly departed from this moral order, has clearly departed from what it ought to follow. And when this happens, when a nation falls away from the laws of justice, nature fights back. It always finds a way of punishing these aberrations. And this is being demonstrated through the absolute poverty of the working people. If things were right, they would have jobs which paid fairly. They would have employment which would mean they could survive. That's Carlyle's view. Nature shows through the aberration of nature is showing that these people have betrayed the just by telling it out through death, essentially, for Carlyle. And again, this is a very Calvinist point of view, that there is a moral order shaped by the will of God, immutable, fixed, and that departure from it is reflected in divine judgment. And this idea that nature shows it can be seen certainly in earlier Calvinism. There was a sense that everything that happens is according to divine providence. It's either a blessing from God or a judgment from God, depending on our behavior. And communities would often, when there was disaster at a national or communal level, engage in what's called public fasting. So engage in a ritual where they would essentially repent of the things that they had done wrong in the hopes that God would divert judgment away, because they saw these things as God telling them essentially, you are doing wrong, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. Hell awaits if you do not change your ways. Now, and there was public fasting going on even through the Victorian era. I think around the time of Dunkirk, so in the 20th century, there was still calls for public fasting at a national level. So this is something Carlyle knows of. And so when he's saying that nature is telling us that we have departed from the just and the moral, he's tapping into this Calvinist framework once again. So it's important then to follow the moral law, and that the law, the divine law, or the just, is what governs a society. So how do we go about implementing that for Carlyle? What will enable our society, or England for him in this period, to return to the just? Well, he's quite critical of a number of suggestions, particularly the idea that we can take a Morrison's pill. And this is the subject of chapter 4. The idea of the Morrison's pill. Well, a Morrison pill was a craze during the Victorian era where this guy was selling pills, Morrison, and he was advertising that they could heal people of many illnesses. Now, they were very ineffectual and didn't achieve very much. And this is Carlyle's point, that you can have a policy proposal or a suggestion for tweaking one aspect, and it's going to fix the whole system, but it won't. It's a myth. It's a lie. It's not enough to repeal the Corn Laws. It's not enough to change from a conservative to a liberal government. These are not going to fix the systemic problem, the deeper problem of not following the just. What's actually needed is character reformation. In this last chapter, he spoke a bit about it. We have to begin with ourselves. It's the individual whose moral character has to be reformed. And this includes both at a ruling class level, but also your ordinary person. So Bobus, the sausage maker, he's often quite mentioning, that's your everyman. That's the ordinary guy working away. He too must undergo character transformation. And why is that? Well, Carlyle is convinced that most of us do not follow the just. We might think we do. We might believe that our actions are guided by what is good and true. But actually, in reality, when we analyze the motivations for what we're doing, oftentimes it's not out of service to the good or the true. He goes into this in quite a bit of detail in chapter 5, the aristocracy of talent. He suggests, for example, that Bobus, the sausage maker's sausage-making business, well, he's not necessarily doing it to follow the just. He wants to make money. He wants to be wealthy. He wants to be respectable within the community. He wants to advance his career. and to buy fashionable things. And crucially, if he had the opportunity to be like one of the elites, having a luxurious and splendid life, he would take it. He's just not able to. We could maybe compare this with Gyges' ring in Plato. Plato had this great story, I believe it's in the Republic, of Gyges' ring. The idea is that Gyges, he's fortunate enough to have a ring which makes him invisible. Now, Gyges was seen to be a moral character, but when he got this ring, he started doing mischievous things. He started playing pranks, he started stealing things. And the point of the story is, well, Gyges, when he's unaccountable, when he can get away with it, then he will do these dark things, which tells us something about Gyges. Underlying his veneer of morality is actually somebody whose desires are fundamentally wicked. Maybe we could see this in Nietzsche too. The idea that most people are not moral, but are rather cowardly. They would do bad things if they could get away with it, but they're scared of the consequences. So they act with a kind of civil morality out of fear, not out of serving the just. This is the very thrust of Carlyle's point here. There is another reason too. The hero, the person who can lead and reshape society to their will, or more importantly, in accordance with the just, cannot emerge from a society where the majority of its people are not themselves just, nor can they rule a society in which the majority of people are unjust. And he has a strong sense that the, the the community has to be following the good and the true for somebody to emerge from it that is good. And the reason why we have quacks and sham leaders and politicians who act not in accordance with the just, who pursue money and wealth and honor and respect and pleasure, is because we ourselves are like that. They emerged from us. And so each of us has to change first before there can be change at the top. At the same time, say we did have a heroic figure in England. So imagine if Aragorn from The Lord of the Rings, who I think is an embodiment of Carlyle's heroic man, came to rule the UK today. Would he be able to? Would he be able to govern our country? I think Carlyle would believe probably not, because most of us do not follow the just. So we would reject him. We would make it impossible for him to rule justly. So we need to reform. We need to change, is Carlyle's message, from the very top to the very bottom. And this message, it's not just a simple change. It's not just self-improvement. It's not adding a few things to our character while we fundamentally remain the same. No, it requires a new creation or a new man coming into being. It's going to be painful. It's going to be tough, he warns us. It's going to change a lot about who we are. And so it's going to be painful because we're going to have to lose things that we already love, that we worship, as it were, and replace them with new things that are not respectable to the majority of society, that are not honored, and they're not necessarily going to make us wealthy. This idea, again, ties in with Carlyle's Calvinist upbringing. In Calvinism, at least the Scottish variant, there was a strong sense that a person needed to undergo a cognitive, affective, and behavioral transformation, and this was essential to salvation. First, a person had to recognize that they had failed to keep God's law. So it was not enough just to recognize one had failed once or twice. One had to realize that one's entire life, essentially, had been one of sin, that their motivations were always corrupted, that all of their actions were never just out of duty to God, but always had some malevolent self-interest involved. And this was supposed to create deep fear, terror, despair at one's own condition, that one deserves damnation. So you can already see here a lot of what Carlyle's already been saying about failing to keep the law, the just, and recognizing this in ourselves, that we need to self-analyze. That's one of his recommendations. That's key to this kind of Calvinism. The next step for the Calvinist was then to, once one had lost all sense of one's own righteousness before God, to rely solely on Jesus Christ for one's salvation, to rely on God's grace and mercy, and to accept it as that God loves you and redeems you. Following that, this is supposed to create a love for God, a reciprocated thankfulness and desire to do what is right. And through this changing of desire for love of God, to want God and to obey God's will, one is able to follow the law of God. So you've gone almost full circle. You're now able to fulfill the law you were not able to do before when you worshipped other things. So this transformation of desire is critical to the Calvinist conception of salvation. For Carlyle, it's the same process. It's the transformation of desire, of what we worship. Worship being whatever we love most or desire most and honor most. That enables us to follow the just. And that's why he's advocating that we need to have an inner transformation first before we even think about changing society. And indeed, he would argue that if you've not undergone this transformation in any meaningful sense, it's better not to even think about politics at large until you have. It's very much in this respect similar to somebody like Jordan Peterson today, who I remember seeing in various places talking about sort your own life out, and then you can worry about climate change and whatnot afterwards. Coming now to the concept of hero worship, which is something interesting in Carlyle. I think this concept helps us to see that for Carlyle, the just isn't just something that's abstract. It's not out there in a way that's intangible. Rather, hero worship, so the elevation and adoration of particular individuals, tells us what we honor most. He argues, for example, that when in his society someone like Byron, the poet, is being adored, or Robert Burns, he also alludes to, this is a sign that it worships the wrong heroes. Why? Because their values that they embody in their life and actions and work is not necessarily the just. By contrast, when it comes to somebody like the figure Odin or Muhammad, for him, these are embodiments, concrete embodiments of the just. And so our adoration of them is, whether it be religious or secular or civic, however you adore these figures, it's a sign of adoring the just. So we can see maybe it's in fictional works, maybe it's in religious context, maybe it's actual historical figures. Whatever we worship, as it were, is an indication of the principles we also follow. We might think here that he's alluding to a sort of incarnational idea. Christ is the archetype of the just man. This was a common idea in the Victorian era. Kant certainly uses that idea. So it's vital that we not only honor principles, but we think about who we're honoring too, for Carlyle. Once we have started to have people with this reformation of character, then for Carlyle, their movement will grow. There's an almost inevitable ending to this story for him, that justice will win out. whether it means the destruction of England or that England is reformed and becomes a just society with just rulers and a just people. Either way, nature and the just is going to succeed. It has an eschatological idea that it's always where the universe is tending, this perfect place. It can't be overridden by how immoral things are. And this should give us courage in his view, that because of the certainty of where things are going, even if we don't experience it in our own lives, we can be confident that we're on the side that's going to be victorious, that justice will rule. Thus, we do not need to fear the quacks or the politicians who say they're fighting for justice, but in reality aren't, because we know where things are tending. And again, this is rooted in his Calvinist theology. Calvinism had a strong sense of eschatology, that Christ will return at the last judgment and put the worlds to rights. This is fundamental to Carlyle. It maybe could also be seen as Aristotelian, that teleology always works itself out. It's always tending this way. Or maybe even Hegelian, that there's a process to all reality. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and it's going to come together eventually. So those are just some overview thoughts of Carlyle's past and present. Just going to look at the comments now and see if people have any views or questions or thoughts that they want to share. Let's have a look. Michael Warren says, "Hey Nathan, would you take a look at the author-philosopher Paul Brunton sometime, particularly the hidden teaching beyond yoga and the follow-up, the wisdom of the overself?" Well, Michael, I'd be happy to give him a look. Sounds interesting. I'll have to see what period it's written in if I was to do any audiobooks. That's one of the things I have to be careful with, is finding texts which are copyright allowed on YouTube. But I'm be more than happy to give him a look, and maybe I'll see what I can get out of it. Hello to you, Great White Lobster. San Manuel, a moral failing in ourselves. Yeah, I mean, that's really what Carlyle's saying, that actually it's not enough just to think about politics or changing the structure of society. You have to begin with yourself and recognizing that you probably don't live up to the values we need to see society changed for the better. And that's a painful thing. And he doesn't think a lot of people will be able to do it, or that a lot of people will be capable of overcoming these things. We might have limited progress, but even just acknowledging that moral failing is critical to it's critical to the process of transformation, which he really believes in. Thanks, Michael. Early 1900s. That's super. San Manuel. Are we closer to that today or further on average? Could you clarify what do you mean by closer to? What are you thinking is closer to or further away from? Great White Bloodster. Fantastic that you're reading Yoki. I haven't read any yet. I was saving it for after Carlyle. So I'm definitely going to give him a look. He sounds really interesting. And again, one of these, as you say, obscure thinkers, which really challenges the assumptions of modern democracies in the West. That democracy is a good thing, that individualism, atomism, these are necessarily good things. Equality is a good thing. These people like these who offer a completely other vision are fantastic to read, and it's exciting. You're so right. It's exciting that there's so many YouTube channels now looking into them and offering maybe a starting point for developing new ways of thinking about human beings and the societies they create. Thank you, Sam Manuel. It's a really interesting one because in some ways we definitely are closer in somewhat distorted ways. So you could see, for example, uh, in intersectional politics, ideas of some groups as being inherently evil, or certain ideologies as being inherently evil. So when people talk about whiteness as being oppressive, this is a notion of identifying original sin, as it were, in certain groups. Maybe recently, just the other day, we've had discussion around men being inherently violent. Now, these views, I think, may have some merit in them. There is certainly in the idea that men have inherent violence to us. Something Jordan Peterson talks about is how most of us would probably have been uh, either supportive of or even collaborators in the Nazi uh, regime. That's just human nature. It's who we are, that we can do unspeakable things. However, at the same time, these kind of groups that make these sorts of claims about whiteness or uh, men in general, and I'm sure there's many others, that other targets that are seen as evil, don't consider other everybody like that. There's certain groups which are inherently good or oppressed and not morally responsible themselves. They can never be evil. And so it's a somewhat twisted view of it. They don't recognize the failing in themselves. And it's that lack of uh, it's that lack of their it's a lack of seeing their own depravity, which I think holds back a lot of the conversation. But as others have pointed out, this probably has its roots in Rousseau and then later Marx, because for Rousseau, the natural state of human beings is one of utter freedom, and they are in in their own nature good. It's only with the coming of civilization, with society and its rules, that people are oppressed, that they suffer, that they're forced into evil states, as it were. So human nature can never be bad on that view. If you have a sense of yourself like that, where you need to just overthrow the norms and the rules that oppress, then an idea of one's own failings is probably going to hold you back. And in fact, it's often portrayed as, well, the idea is itself a tool of power. The idea that you are totally depraved is a way of controlling you. So, in answer to your question, I realize that's quite a long answer going down many routes. I think, in one sense, there is a notion that there are failings, but it's very selective, and it's not in the way that Carlyle would imagine it at all. Great. Well, if I'll just give a minute or two for any further questions. While we're doing that, I'll just give you a kind of update on where I want to go next with Carlyle. So the next book is book 2, The Ancient Monk, and this one is quite how to put it? It's quite different in tone. It's more like a historical novel almost. It can be sometimes it feels you wonder where Carlyle's going, but it's essentially trying to demonstrate from a character called Abbot Sampson what the heroic person looks like, and it's quite long. So what I'm thinking of doing for that book is maybe doing a series of live streams, just reading it through, and just taking the time to do that, uh, because that's the best way to get through it. And it's quite interesting. It's quite fun at parts, and it's fun seeing how Abbot Sampson gets along in the monastery. Uh, Beyond that, with the channel, I've got some videos. Hopefully, in the future, I'll get around to. I still need to complete the Origins of Liberalism series, looking at the final video will be on music and how views of music changed, and what that tells us about different ideas of order in the universe, particularly looking at Pythagoras and Descartes once again. Then beyond that, at some point, I'm going to do a stream on the scouring of the Shire, which should be a lot of really interesting and a lot of fun. I think I read it recently, and it's the penultimate chapter of the Lord of the Rings. It's really, it's just so relevant for today. I won't spoil anything. It's just so much of it, and the situation it within those pages, and the way people respond to things just echoes the culture we live in today with its rules and regulations. Let's put it that way. And then beyond that, there's lots of things to be talking about. But one of them that I hope to do in at some point is looking at music in sacred contexts, sacred music, and kind of issues around that, and what's the purpose of music in a sacred context? How does it change us? What's its function? How does the music, how do the lyrics affect us? So on and so forth, particularly in a Scottish context. So we'll get to that at some point. It doesn't seem to be any more comments, so all there is to say is thank you so much for joining me for this stream. I've really enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed your comments as well, and it's been a real pleasure. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and wherever you are, God be with you. Bye for now.